Well, hey there, everyone. Welcome to today's training for the Badass Moneymakers. We are going to get started in just a minute here. Bear with me. We are doing things a little bit differently tech-wise today because I am actually a little bit sick. So I am not going to go on camera today. I'm going to spare you that. But I just want to make sure that y'all can hear me. And I think it looks good. But bear with me one second as I test this. Okay, perfect. So it looks like our audio is good. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. If you are watching live and you've got questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments. And otherwise, we will get going on this. So today's training is all about 1099s. And this is maybe not one of the most fun trainings we're going to do, but it's certainly one of the most important because this is the form that comes up once a year, every January, and everybody starts scrambling, wondering what the heck it is. Do they need to file it? What do they need to do with it? And so that's why I wanted to do this training for you, because 1099s really aren't that complicated. They don't need to be that complicated. We don't need to stress about them. But I know that the whole process can seem very confusing. So we are going to dive in. Hold on. I just want to go ahead and put my computer on Do Not Disturb. Just make sure we're good there. Okay, perfect. I don't want any text messages or anything bugging us. And okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. So first and foremost, let's talk about what is actually a 1099. So a 1099 is an information filing form. And what we mean by that is it's a form that provides information. So it doesn't, it's not calculating anything. It's not giving you any sort of result. It's just providing information to the tax authorities. Now, the form we're going to talk about today is the 1099 that reports non-salary income to the IRS. And actually, the entire 1099 series reports non-salary income to the IRS. So there are different types of Form 1099s, and I've listed just a few of the most popular ones here. But again, all of these are reporting non-salary income, so income that you may have earned not as an employee. So for example, the 1099 miscellaneous in the past has reported freelancer and independent contractor income. The 1099 INT has reported interest income if you've got a savings or an investment account. The 1099S reports real estate transactions. The 1099-C reports canceled debt income. So if you got a loan and then the loan was forgiven, you would potentially owe tax on that loan forgiveness. The 1099-R reports any withdrawals you took out of your retirement plans. And then the 1099-DIV reports dividend income. And there are many other 1099 forms as well, but these are the most popular. So all of these forms, again, report non-salary income to the IRS, and it basically tells them this is the income I received this year that needs to be included on my tax return. Now, this form is a federal tax form. It's and I actually shouldn't have said not for state tax purposes, because the 1099 is a federal tax form. It's going to be reported to the IRS. Many states do have their own 1099 reporting requirements. And depending on the state, usually the form is just a little bit different looking, but sometimes they'll actually take the federal 1099 form. So that bullet's a little misleading there. What I really meant to say there was it's a federal form, the 1099, but you may in fact have state filing requirements as well. And we're going to talk about those. Okay, so let's go to our next slide here. I'm doing this on like 10 different devices. So I'm trying to make sure, there we go. There we go, get to our next slide. Now, I mentioned on the last slide that the 1099 MISC, 1099 miscellaneous, is what we've used in the past to report freelancer or contractor income. Well, that is changing this year for 2020. So for 2020 and future years, non-employment income for freelancers and contractors will get reported on 1099 NEC. 1099 MISC, miscellaneous, is still going to exist as a form. We're just not going to put this income on that form. We've got our own new form now. Actually, this form existed back in the 70s. They've brought it back, and so now we're putting that freelancer and contractor income on Form 1099, excuse me, 1099 NEC. And I just want to mention here, I think I may actually say this on the next slide as well, but the person who paid the money is the one who's actually going to file the form. So I own my business. If I hire someone to build me a website, I hire a contractor to build me a website, and I pay them $1,000 for that. I'm going to file the 1099 NEC to report to the IRS the $1,000 that I paid to them. So the contractor is not the one filing this form. It's the person, it's the business owner who paid for the contractor's services. I just want to clarify that before we move on. Okay, so I don't know why my little clicker here isn't working. That's all right. We'll keep moving it like that. So the big question really is, okay, well, who do we need to file a 1099 NEC for? So you generally have to file a 1099 NEC if you paid an independent contractor, we're going to call them ICs from now on, if you paid an independent contractor more than $600 during the course of the year for business purposes. So that's the first thing I want to just clarify real fast. If you hired somebody to come into your house and, I don't know, paint your walls, that's a personal purpose. So you're not going to issue them a 1099 NEC. We're just talking about business purposes, and we're just talking about people who you paid $600 or more during the course of a year. So an example would be, like I said before, a web developer, or if you hired a graphic designer or copywriter, or maybe somebody to do some social media stuff for you. And again, to reiterate, the business owner is the one who pays, I don't know why it says who pays, files the form. I should say who pays and files the form, not the contractor who receives the money. So we're putting ourselves in the business owner's shoes right now, and thinking about whether or not we need to file the form. Now, you as a business owner may get some 1099s. So, if I were a web designer and someone hired me to do their website, then I might get a 1099 NEC from them. So as a business owner, you may also get some 1099 NECs, but today we're really just talking about the ones that you need to file. Now, the other thing I want to note, and this is really important, if you are an independent contractor, even if you don't get a Form 1099 NEC, so my web designer example, I built you a website, you paid me $1,000, but you don't send me a 1099 NEC, I, as the contractor, still need to report that income on my tax return. So even if you don't get this form, if you earned the money, if you got the income, you still have to report it for tax purposes. And the reason that this comes up, we're going to get into one of the exceptions for filing 1099 NEC in a few minutes. But there's this one big exception, which ends up resulting in a lot of contractors not getting a 1099 for this income. And what will end up happening is, it's a great exception for all of us business owners because it means we have to file fewer of these. But on the flip side, what it means is a lot of contractors come back to the businesses and say, hey, you never issued me a 1099. And then the worry there, of course, is that the contractor may just not report the income. So even if you don't get the form, you still need to report all of the income that you make. And I'm going kind of fast here, but if y'all have questions, please put them in the comments. I'm happy to stop and clarify something if it's not clear. So before we move on, I just want to touch on real quickly who actually is an independent contractor, because this term gets thrown around a lot in the business world, and there are actually official definitions, and I just want to be super clear about who we're talking about. So an independent contractor is someone that you hire to complete a project or to provide a service for business purposes that is not an employee. Now, in today's training, we're not getting into the true differences between a contractor and an employee. That's a really big and important issue of tax law that we actually will do a workshop on, because I can tell you a lot of people are doing this wrong, and that's okay. Don't panic. We'll definitely get there. But basically, this is anybody who you're not treating as an employee, who you're paying to do something for you for business purposes. Now, for the purposes of Form 1099, we're talking about individuals, we're talking about LLCs, we're talking about partnerships, limited partnerships, LPs, or estates. So if your independent contractor is any of those things, whether they're an individual, an LLC, or whatnot, if they're any of those things, that's who we're talking about today. Oh, my arrow just does not want to work. People who should not get a Form 1099 NEC are listed here. So first and foremost, employees. We just talked about them, right? They're not independent contractors. They are employees. They're going to get a Form W-2 that's separate. And hopefully you're working with a payroll service that just automatically issues them a Form W-2. If you're not and you have employees, I would highly recommend having a payroll service. Like Gusto is one that I use, GUSTO. I highly recommend them, but there are others. They will take care of all that paperwork for you. So employees do not get a Form 1099 NEC. Corporations do not get a Form 1099 NEC, with one exception, which we'll get to in a second. And when we say corporations, we're talking about S-Corps C corps or S corps. So if you are working with someone who is an LLC, for example, and they've elected to be classified as an S corp, then you actually don't need to issue them a 1099 NEC. Now you might be sitting here thinking, how the hell am I supposed to know this? And we're going to talk about that in a few slides, so don't worry, we're going to get there. But just know that if they are a C corp or an S corp, you don't need to issue them a 1099 NEC. The exception is actually lawyers, believe it or not. So even if you work with a lawyer and their entity formation is a corporation, you actually still need to issue them a 1099 NEC. It's kind of this one weird rule just to make sure that lawyers' income gets reported. I actually don't know the history behind that, but now that I've said it, I'm super curious and I kind of want to look it up because I feel like there are some lawyer jokes we could make there. My husband's a lawyer, so I think I can make those. But I'm curious now actually about that exception, so I'm going to look up why that exists. The other people who should not get a Form 1099 NEC are people who are paid through third-party payment processors. And this is that big exception I was mentioning a few minutes ago. We're going to get there. I'm going to explain exactly what that means. Just know for now that that's one of the categories of people who should not get a Form 1099 NEC. And then the last category of people who should not get a Form 1099 NEC, y'all say that 3 times fast, that is really hard, are sellers of merchandise, freight, storage, or similar items. So if you, if you sell, I always struggle to come up with product examples because I'm not a product-based business. If you sell notebooks, this is my go-to. If you sell notebooks, you create these custom beautiful notebooks and you purchase the paper from someone, from a vendor, you don't have to issue them a 1099 NEC for the purchase of the paper because they've sold you merchandise. It's really only services or like projects that we're really talking about here with the 1099 NEC. Cool? All right, and let me know if y'all have any questions about that. Okay, so this is the third-party payment processor exception that I want to talk about. And like I said, this is a big one. And there are actually a lot of people out there who are filing 1099s who probably don't need to because of this exception. That said, this is my very big that said. That said, I have actually always told people, and I go back and forth on this every year if this is the advice I want to give, but I always tell people, when in doubt, file the 1099 anyway. Because there are penalties if you fail to file a 1099 that's required. And as far as I've seen to this point, there's no penalty or no downside to filing a Form 1099 NEC if you didn't have to. So this is a really big exception that likely exempts you from filing a 1099 NEC for most or maybe all of the contractors you paid. But if you're still nervous or you're just not sure, go ahead and file one anyway. It's not going to be that much work. It's not going to be that much hassle. And if it gives you peace of mind, okay. So the exception here is that you do not have to file a 1099 NEC if you basically paid this person through what's called a third-party payment processor. And there are several examples of this. So the first category of third-party payment processors would be something like a freelance marketplace. So this would be an Upwork or a Fiverr, where you're hiring them on those sites, you're paying through that site. So that site is actually facilitating that payment. And then the person gets paid via that site. So that's the first example. The second example is the sort of method of payment. So regardless of where you hired the person or found the person, if you're paying them through a credit card or a debit card or any other type of third-party payment processing site, such as PayPal, Stripe, or Square, then you actually do not have to file a Form 1099 NEC. And the reason for that is because these third-party payment processors actually have their own 1099 filing requirements. They actually file what's called a 1099-K. And I forget the exact number, but they are required to file it if it's, I believe it's either 200 transactions or $20,000 in sales, I want to say. It's the dollar amount I'm not sure on. But they have this filing requirement as well. Now, this is that loophole that I was talking about earlier, where you might get contractors who come back to you and say, hey, you paid me, where's my 1099? This is the loophole, because if you fall under this exception, so let's say I pay my web designer the $1,000, I pay them via PayPal, PayPal business. Okay. I pay them PayPal business $1,000. So I decide I don't need to file the 1099 NEC for them. That's correct. I don't need to do that, right? Well, let's just say that was the only money they received via PayPal. So PayPal is going to say, well, we don't need to file a 1099K for them because they haven't hit the 200 transactions or $20,000 filing requirement. So now what happens is that web designer isn't going to get a 1099 at all for the $1,000 that I paid them. So they may come back to me and say, hey, where's my 1099? And this has happened to me. And I've had to explain to people who come back to me and say, actually, I don't need to issue you one. And that's what you would do is you would say, I'm actually not required to issue you one because I paid via a third-party payment processor. That third-party payment processor site has their own filing requirements, and you may or may not receive a 1099 from them. But I just bring this up because a lot of times contractors, rightfully so, because this is confusing, contractors get confused by this. And so if they come back to you and are asking questions, I don't want you to feel panicked and go, oh my God, shoot, was I supposed to file one for them, or when I didn't do that. And I do just want to reiterate here for all the contractors out there that even if you don't get that 1099, you still have to report that income. I know I keep saying that, but it's so important that I had one contractor say to me one year, she reached out to me, said, where's my 1099? I explained to her why I hadn't sent one. And she said, well, so how am I supposed to know how much to report on my tax return? And I sort of, cringed a little bit, but then very, very kindly explained to her that, this is why as business owners, contractors, freelancers, whatever we want to call ourselves, this is why we need to be tracking our own numbers via an accounting system or even Excel. If that's just where you're at, that's fine, but just tracking those numbers so that you know what you've earned. This is another reason why I highly recommend having a separate business bank account. Even if you're an individual and you don't need to have one, having a separate business bank account so that you can go back at the end of the year and very easily see what you've earned. I will tell you, I never, ever, 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 ever rely on my 1099s to report my income in my business. I don't get very many, but I get some. I will look at them when they come in and I will just do like a quick, oh, is that what I have reported? Just to make sure that my accounting system is correct, right? Like I want to make sure that I'm reporting the income correctly, but I never rely on the 1099s. I'm going to go to my own accounting records. That is what I'm going to report because more often than not, my accounting records are going to have the full scope of income. My 1099s are not. Now, the last thing I want to say about this third-party payment processor exception is cash transfers via cash apps do not qualify for this exception. So if you have paid people via Zelle, via Venmo or Cash App, they do not qualify for this exception. And the additional thing I want to say about this is you actually shouldn't be using these apps anyway for business purposes. I don't know about Cash App. I'm assuming this is the case. I don't know Cash App very well. But Zelle and Venmo, their terms of service do not, or terms of use, actually do specifically prohibit using their services for business purposes. I know a lot of business owners who use these, and so, you're not alone if you do, but I would highly recommend getting off of these apps. They are specifically not for business purposes, and you can actually lose your account if they figure out that you're using them for business purposes. So this is why I recommend going to a payment processor like PayPal or Stripe or Square. And by the way, when I say PayPal, I mean PayPal Business, not PayPal Friends and Family. And the thing I always hear at this point usually is someone will say, well, yeah, but I don't want to pay the fees. I get it. The fees suck. But transaction fees are just a cost of doing business. And if you are doing something to avoid, if you're using a service that you're not allowed to use to avoid the fees, then you're putting your business at risk. So what I would do instead is get signed up on a service that is specifically meant for business transactions, and then just build the cost of those fees into your pricing so that you're comfortable using that service. Okay, so this is the big exception here. And this one pretty much wipes out all of my 1099 filing requirements because I pay my people through Square. I don't really pay anybody through PayPal, but usually, Square is the big one for me that I pay people through. But again, I want to reiterate, if you have any concerns, there are years when I've done this too, you can still file those 1099s if you want to. You're not required to. I want to make that very clear. You do not have to. The tax law is very clear on this. I'm not telling you to do that because there's any open question, But I just know that sometimes people get really nervous about this and they just feel like they just want to file them anyway. So if you want to do that, you can, but this is the big exception. Now, I wanted to show you the 1099 forms just really quickly here. They're very, very straightforward, but in case you've never seen one before. Now, I'm going to tell you how to file the 1099 forms, and I will tell you the way I'm going to suggest you do it is the easiest way possible. It does cost a little bit of money, but it's the easiest way possible, and it actually means that you don't even need to know how to fill out the form itself because the service is going to do it for you. But I will show you how to fill this out in case you decide to fill out your own forms. So pretty simple up here, you're going to put, your name, address, information. You're going to put your TIN, which is your taxpayer identification number. Usually that's going to be your EIN. It could be your social security number if you don't have a business entity. You're going to put your recipient's info here, also their TIN, taxpayer identification number. So again, if they're an individual, it'll be their social security number. If they're an LLC or whatnot, it's going to be probably their EIN. You're going to put their address here. And then this is the big box right here, box number 1, non-employee compensation. So this is actually where you're going to put all the money you paid them. And so this is why it's important to have good accounting records so you can just quickly pull this up and say, oop, I paid them $1,000. There we go. And then, okay, so then I'm going to skip just for a second and come back up. So box number 4, federal income tax withheld. I'm going to assume you probably have not done this. In like 99% of the cases, if you're paying a contractor, you will not have withheld tax. There may be a few situations where you would. We're not really going to get into those today because I don't think they're really going to apply to anyone. But just know that most likely this box will be 0. But if you did actually withhold federal or state tax on their payments, then you would list that here. And if you were doing state tax withheld, you'd put the amount here, you'd put the state, whatever their number was, and then you'd put the income allocated to that state. Again, I suspect that you're not going to deal with any of this stuff, but I do just want to point that out. I do also, we're going to skip this checkbox. This is like probably not going to apply to any of y'all. Yeah, I'm going to skip that. We're not going to talk about that today because I don't think that's going to matter to anyone. Okay, so that's the IRS copy. Now, there are actually 2 to 3 copies of the 1099. So if you physically had a paper copy of it, which yes, you can actually contact the IRS and get physical copies of the 1099s to send out. If you physically did that, you would get 3 copies. And so the first would be the IRS copy. It'd be copy A. It'll say for Internal Revenue Service Center. The second copy is copy 1 for State Tax Department. It's all of the same information. Nothing's changed. This is just the copy that you would send to the state if you needed to send a copy to the state. And then the third copy is copy B, which is actually for the recipient. And so this copy does not get sent to the IRS. This gets sent to the individual, the contractor. And again, it's the same information on each form. It's just different forms going to different places. Okay, so let's go through the steps now of how to actually file the Form 1099 NEC. And I just want to do one thing real fast here. Okay, perfect. And again, just let me know if y'all have any questions as we go through. So the first step is to actually gather the information you need. So you're going to need the contractor's full legal name. It's important that you have their full legal name, not just the name they go by. You've got their mailing address. You've got their taxpayer identification number. Again, that's going to be their social security number or their EIN, depending on if they're an individual or a legal entity. And then you're going to need the amount you pay them during the year. And that should, of course, come from your own accounting records. Now, the question that I talked about earlier where you might be saying, well, how do I get all of this information? Well, there's a form called Form W-9. Now, this is the standard form that we use to request this information from our contractors. I generally recommend that you integrate this form into your onboarding process when you bring on a new contractor or when you hire a new contractor, and you actually get them to fill out the form before you pay them. That way, you know you get the form filled out, right? It's not required to do that. It's just good practice. That way you make sure you have the form on file. But if you haven't done that, don't panic. You can go back to them now and ask for Form W-9. And hope you get that information from them at this point. So what I do in my business is I ask for this form from every contractor I pay, whether or not I think I'm going to pay them $600 or more. And the reason is because number one, it's just a standard part of my practice. It makes my life simpler to just sort of automatically ask for it. But number two, if I pay them $200 now and then, I decide to hire them 2 weeks before the end of the year and I pay them $500, well, all of a sudden now I'm over that limit and I don't want to be scrambling at that time trying to figure out, well, are we going to be over $600? Should I request this form? So I just request it automatically. I have it on file for all of my contractors. That way I never have to worry if we've crossed that $600 threshold. Now, Form W-9 you can get right off the IRS's website. It's we'll put a link to it in the both on Facebook and in the membership portal. We'll put a link to it underneath this training afterwards. But you can honestly just Google IRS W-9 and it'll pop right up. It's a fairly straightforward form. If people come to you and ask how to fill out the form, I would direct them back to the IRS website. I would not help them fill out the form because you don't want to, you're not a tax advisor and you don't want to sort of give them, incorrect information. So I would just send them to the tax website. And, again, it's generally for most people a fairly straightforward form. The one thing I will mention here, actually two things I want to mention here. Form W-9 is for U.S. Citizens and residents and basically U.S. taxpayers. If you are hiring somebody who is not a U.S. citizen or resident, then you're actually, instead of giving them Form W-9, you're actually going to give them Form W-8 BEN, B-E-N. And that is for international folks. And essentially what that form does, they're going to fill out that form and they're going to do one of two things on that form. Either they're going to say, yes, I'm an international person and I've performed services in the United States, therefore I'm subject to tax. And so I need you to withhold tax on my payments, in which case you'll have to withhold tax. Or they're going to check and say, I'm an international person. I'm not performing any services in the United States. Therefore, you do not need to withhold tax from me. And that form is really important to have on file, because if the IRS ever came in and said, well, why didn't you withhold tax on payments you made to this person? You could pull up that W-8 BEN, B-E-N, and say, I didn't because they certified that they are not a U.S. taxpayer and that I did not need to withhold. So that's actually a really important form to have if you're hiring contractors outside of the country. I did this last year. My web designer was in Canada. So I had her file a W-8 BEN, and that was a very important form for me to have, because she certified, no, you do not have to withhold taxes on these funds. I am not subject to tax in the United States. I'm not going to end up having to pay tax in the United States. So you can just pay me my money and we're good. So that's the W-8 BEN or BEN. The W-9 is for US folks, and it effectively does sort of a similar thing, except what it does is when you give someone a W-9, so if I'm a web designer and you ask me for a W-9 and I complete it for you and I give it to you, what I'm essentially doing is two things. Number one, I'm giving you my taxpayer identification number, my social security number or my EIN, so that you can report the income you pay me to the IRS. But I'm also certifying that I will report that income. I'm basically saying, yes, I'm a US taxpayer. I'm going to go ahead and report this income. So you're good. And so that's why we want to have that Form W-9 on file. And by the way, you want to keep it on file for 4 years. That's the requirement. So that's why it's really important to have this form. So again, if you haven't already done this, that's okay. Go back and request it now. Now, if you ultimately don't get it, this is where it gets kind of tricky. I will drop in the comments some of the IRS guidance on what to do if you do not get the form. Like if you just never hear from the person, they never respond to you, because that can get a little bit tricky. But you still want to try to file the Form 1099 if you can. And again, I will drop in the comments instructions on how to do that. If that happens to you, it very rarely happens, but if it happens and you get really, really stuck, just let me know, drop into one of our Q&A sessions or let me know in the group and we can do maybe like a mini training on how to get through that. Okay, so let's move on then to step number 2. So you've got their information, you've got that Form W-9 now on file. First step is you're going to fill out the 1099 NEC. You're going to confirm the total amount paid is correct. This is one of the most important parts, right? Because you're reporting their income to the tax authorities. And you want to confirm that their TIN, taxpayer identification number, is correct. This is also super important because if you file it and it's the wrong TIN number, then it could get bounced back, or you could even potentially get fined if they can't link it up with the correct person. So that's step number 2, is to actually fill out the form. Step number 3, we're going to start submitting these forms. So remember, copy A goes to the IRS. Now you can submit this electronically or via mail. Either way, it's due January 31st of 2021. This is typically, that date typically doesn't change year to year, but do note that it used to be February. Now it's January. Moving forward, it should continue to be January 31st. Now, if you are filing by mail, here's what you have to do. You actually have to obtain a physical form. So you can't just go to the IRS's website and print, download and print the 1099 NEC. You've got to actually get the official physical form. And you can do this a couple of ways. The first is you can go to the IRS website and actually order the forms. They'll physically mail them to you. Or I do know that some office supply stores, like I was actually just at Staples the other day, and they had, the little shelf of tax forms. You can actually buy a pack of the tax forms and do that. So if you want to hand fill them out, or you can put them in your printer and print on them, fill them out. But if you want to do that and physically mail them in, that's your option. You either need to request them from the IRS or get them from an office supply store. You can't just print out the form from the website. If you do that, if you decide to mail the physical copies into the IRS, you also need to include Form 1096, which I didn't pull up, but basically is just a list of all of the 1099s that you're submitting. It's essentially to just keep the filing submission organized, but you've got to have that form if you're mailing stuff in. Now, if you're submitting 250 or more forms, you have to file electronically, and you actually will get a penalty of up to $100 per form if you are required to file electronically and you instead file by paper. Now, what they'll actually do in that case is the first 250 that you filed by paper, they won't charge you a penalty for those because you're allowed to submit those by paper. But any above the 250, you'll get hit with a $100 per form fine. This is I saw this happen to one client once where they had like 500 and they submitted them all by paper, and it was not fun, and they got a massive fine. So I'm guessing this is not the case for most of you, but if you have that many to submit, they need to be done electronically. Okay, so this is copy A, sending to the IRS. Now, you may be asking, how do I do this electronically? We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, so copy B. So copy B, remember, goes to the independent contractor. This is also due by January 31st of 2021. So same deadline for both. Now, for the independent contractors version, you can actually use the version on the IRS website. You can download it and print it out and send that to them. You don't need the fancy form. I will tell you though, when you order the fancy forms from the IRS or the office store, you're going to get all the copies anyway. So this doesn't really help you out, but just letting you know. Now, you can email copy B to the independent contractor, but you need their consent first. And I'm just going to tell you, this is a pain in the ass. So, and I'm pretty sure we put this on a slide. Yes, we did. So you're probably not going to want to do this, but if you do, I'm going to walk you through everything you need to include. And by the way, don't stress about this, because right after I do this, I'm going to tell you the simpler way to do all of this to make your life a lot easier. But if you do want to do these forms yourself and you want to email them to the independent contractor, you actually have to get them to essentially consent, to sign a consent, that does the following things. Number one, you have to clearly state that if they do not consent to receive the Form 1099 via email, they will still get a paper copy. So if they say, no, I don't want it by email, you still got to send them a paper copy. You have to also clarify the extent of their consent. So is it just for 2020 tax year? Is it for all tax years that you work with them? What is the range? You need to provide instructions on how to request a paper copy from you, even if they say yes to getting the electronic one. So you always have to give them the option to get the paper copy, and you've got to be clear about how they do that. You need to include instructions on how to withdraw their consent. So they have to be allowed to withdraw at any time, either electronically, meaning sending you an email, or on paper, meaning sending you a letter. And you have to confirm their withdrawal in writing. So if they withdraw, you have to respond back to them and confirm in writing that you received their withdrawal. You also have to provide the circumstances under which you will not provide Form 1099. So for example, if you end up canceling the contract before you've paid them $600, or you just don't pay them $600 overall, whatever. What are the circumstances in which they wouldn't get a 1099? Another example here would be if you pay them through a third-party payment processor and you use the exception. You also have to include what they need to do to update their contact information with you. So this way, if they change their email, you've made it very clear to them what they have to do so that they can still get their 1099. So it's a lot you've got to include in this. And then lastly, two more things. You've got to indicate what, this one kills me. I mean, this is why this is a pain in the ass and you shouldn't do this. You've got to indicate what hardware and software they need to view and print the form. I'm not shitting you. So you literally have to say, in order to view this form, you will need, PDF reader and you'll need a printer and blah, 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 blah. It's stupid, but these are the rules. And then lastly, you need to include the date when the Form 1099 will be available. So whenever you anticipate that form will be available. So bottom line, this is a pain in the ass. Don't do it. I want you to skip this step and instead use a 1099 service, which we're going to talk about in a second. And by the way, the 1099 service is going to actually make all of the steps, the IRS copy, the state copy, and the contractor copy much, much simpler. But in case you don't want to use the service, I'm giving you everything you need to know. Okay, so once you've sent your contractor copy, the next step is to check to see if you have state filing requirements. So there is what's called the Combined Federal State Filing Program, and this is not just for 1099s, for a bunch of different forms, where basically if you file the form at the federal level, it will also then trickle down to the state. Not every state is part of it, not every form is part of it. Unfortunately, at this point, the 1099 NEC, because it's a brand new form, is not yet part of this. So there is no automatic filing of the 1099 NEC at the state level when you file at the federal level. We may see that. And by the way, we may see it before the end of January. So it could happen this year. I wouldn't hold my breath. It very likely, or hopefully at least, will happen by next year. So this may be the only year that we're having to struggle through this. But just note that right now, as of January 6, 2021, this has not happened yet. Now, you may have filing requirements in a few different places. So you may have filing requirements in the state where you do your business. You may have filing requirements in the state where your contractor resides. And if they reside in one state but actually perform the services in another state, you may have filing requirements there. So, my business is in Massachusetts. If I hire a contractor out of New York, they live in New York. But let's just say I hire them to run an event for me that we do down in Texas. Now I have to check my filing requirements in Massachusetts, New York, and Texas and see where I'm required to file that 1099. So this is where it can get a little tricky. And you've really got to kind of keep detailed notes on where your people live. And by the way, they're going to give that to you on the Form W-9, right? That's their residence. And also where the services are performed. Now, I will tell you with COVID, this has gotten even trickier because you have a lot of people who, let's just use my example, live in New York, but maybe they went and stayed with their parents for 6 months in Texas, right? So maybe they live in New York and normally would perform the services in New York, but now they've gone and lived with their parents for 6 months in Texas because of COVID and whatnot. This gets a little tricky. This is where, if I were you, what I would basically do is write back to, assuming you already have the Form W-9 where they've said what their residence is, I would just go back to them, at the end of the year, or we're in early January. So I'd go back to them in early January and say, hey, I'm getting ready to do your Form 1099. I know you mentioned that your state of residence was New York or whatever. I just wanted to confirm, one, that was your state of residence for the entirety of 2020. And two, that you performed the services for me in New York and not in some other state. So I would probably just send that quick email. This is an email that's not a bad thing to send every year anyway, but I think especially with 2020 and COVID, this is a good email to send just to make sure that you're accurately reporting the 1099s to the states that you need to report them to. Now, you can look up each state's requirements at the link I've given below. So tax1099.com is actually one of the services I'm going to mention to y'all. But you can see these requirements whether or not you use their service. They just have a good database of the different requirements per state. So I would check that. The other thing I just want to mention here, because 1099 NEC is a brand new form, or a form they haven't used in 30 years, but they've brought back, a lot of the states haven't released their rules or requirements about this form yet. So, again, it's January 6th when we're recording this. I would suggest check it out now, see what they say, but I would also suggest maybe looking at their requirements maybe around January 20th or 25th, just to check and see if they've provided any updated requirements because states are still releasing their requirements. So just keep that in mind. That's an issue just for this year because it's a brand new form, but just keep that in mind that not all states may have come out with their requirements at this point. Okay, perfect. So step number 5, we're going to move on. And again, let me know if y'all have any questions because we're getting to the end here. We're almost there. But look, I just walked you through exactly what you need to do if you want to prepare and file the 1099 NECs yourself. That said, I want you to ignore everything I just told you. If you're willing to spend a little bit of money, I want you to consider doing it the much easier way, which is to actually use a service that prepares and files them for you. You've got a few different options. So the first sort of option is using a service that this is what they do. This is all they do specifically. And I only have one recommendation here, but I'm going to give you 2. The first is tax1099.com. And the next one is TRACK1099.com. I'm not affiliated with either one. I have no preference over either one. I've used both. Both are pretty simple. I haven't actually looked at their pricing this year, so I apologize for that. But when I've used these in the past, I want to say max, I spent $15 a form. And I actually think when I looked at tax, and I think it was tax 1099 a few months ago, I think their pricing has actually changed and come down. So it's not terribly expensive. Now, if you have hundreds of 1099s to file, this is, and actually, by the way, if you do, their pricing gets even better. They have a bulk discount. But most of us just have a handful, if that. So I highly recommend using one of these services. It's going to make it so easy for you. You're going to give them the info. They're going to create your 1099. They're going to file it with the IRS and potentially with the state. If now they can't file it necessarily with every state. It depends on what states accept e-files and what states have the requirements and all of that. But if they can't file it on your behalf with the state, they will at least give you the form for you to send in yourself. But they will also send the 1099 to the contractor. So I like that too. So they basically take care of everything with the exception of maybe the state. Now, another option is to actually go through your payroll provider. So if you have, like Gusto certainly does this. I know Square does this. So I pay my contractors through Square if I'm able to. And Square has the ability to send 1099s on my behalf to people. So check your payroll provider and see if that's an option. And sometimes you have to pay, sometimes you don't. I actually don't think I pay with Square, but I do pay a monthly fee to have Square to pay my people. So it essentially is one of the benefits that's rolled into that monthly fee. And then the last option is to actually check out your accounting provider. So I use Wave Apps, and I don't believe they had this option last year, but I noticed this year they do now have the option to do 1099. So I actually am going to look into them as well as Square and see which one makes more sense. So check out your accounting provider. I know QuickBooks does them as well. I would assume most of the others at least have it as an option. And again, you may not have a fee because it may just be one of the benefits of your account, or there might be a small fee. But these are the 3 places to go to have this done for you. And I highly, highly, highly recommend having a service take care of it for you. I cannot stress enough. I mean, if go back through the presentation and those 5 steps I walked you all through, to fill them out yourself, to make sure you get the right copies, you got to order from the IRS. Like, it can be very exhausting and time consuming. So this is, to me, the best way to do it. And it's worth a little bit of money to do it. Okay. So just to recap, I want to just do a real fast recap because that was a lot of information I gave you. The first step you're going to do is determine if you have any filing requirements for 1099. Have you paid a contractor $600 or more? Is it the right entity type? So remember, you don't need to do it for S Corps or C Corps unless they're lawyers. And then lastly, are there any exceptions? Do you fall into the third-party payment processor exception? Are they an employee? Anything like that. Next, you're going to gather the necessary information. That's that Form W-9. Remember, it's okay if you haven't requested it yet. Just go ahead and request it now and then build it into your process moving forward to request it from all new contractors. Third, you're going to prepare that 1099 NEC. Again, if you're going to work with a service, you don't need to prepare it yourself. And fourth, you're going to file copies with the IRS, with the state if applicable, and with the contractor directly. So, all right. That is it. That's all I've got for y'all. We've got still about 13 minutes left. I don't see any questions, but if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the comments right now. I'll give it just a couple of minutes because I know there sometimes the lag on these things, and I want to make sure that I answer all of your questions. If you're watching this on the replay, feel free to drop your questions in the comments and I will try to get to them, or we'll add them to our Q&A for next week. And that's the other thing. Let me pull up the link. I'll put this in the comments as well. So if you are, well, whether you're live or watching on the replay, we will have our Q&A session next week. And so you can submit questions. Hold on, let me type this out. You can submit questions here. I'm dropping it in the comments. And I think that's only putting it on YouTube for some reason. So I'll make sure that that gets submitted to the Facebook thread as well. But the link is megkwheeler.com/QA. If you have questions, here we go. I'll pop up on the screen too. megkwheeler.com/QA if you have questions. And then again, I'll just give it a couple more seconds if anyone watching live has questions. But otherwise, we are going to leave it there. So hope this was helpful. Again, let me know if y'all have questions. Let's go back to, let's bring this baby back. Here, we'll go all the way back to the beginning. And so just as a reminder, we have our Q&A session next week. That will be, let's see what time and date. I believe it's Wednesday. I believe it's actually the same time. We're trying to find the right time for everybody. Yeah, so that'll be next Wednesday, the January 13th at 12 p.m. Eastern. And then the following week, we'll have our hot seat January 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern as well. So I don't see any questions. I'm going to wrap it up there. Hope everyone is having a great week, and I will see you all next week.